Hello and welcome. Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine standing at the edge of the greatest forest you have ever known. The trees rise like ancient pillars around you, their canopy so thick and vast that the sunlight filters through in golden streams, painting everything in shades of emerald and amber. You can hear the whisper of leaves, the distant call of birds whose songs have not been heard in your world for over 1,000 years. You are standing at the threshold of something magnificent, something that once represented the very pinnacle of civilization, magic, and hope in all of Faerûn. You are about to witness the story of Drannor, the city of song, the city of beauty, the city of love. But more importantly, you are about to understand how and why this beacon of light was extinguished, plunged into darkness, and transformed into a legend wrapped in tragedy. The story of Drannor's fall does not begin with its destruction. No, to truly understand what was lost, you must first understand what was built. You must walk its streets when they gleamed with possibility, when the air itself hummed with cooperative magic, when elves and humans and dwarves worked side by side to create something the world had never seen before and may never see again. The fall of Drannor is not merely a tale of war and ruin. It is a story of ambition and dreams, of reaching for something better, and of the terrible price paid when darkness comes for the light. Long before the city bore the name that would echo through the ages, long before it became known as Drannor, it existed as Cormanthor. You must travel back in your mind, far beyond the memories of any living soul, save perhaps the oldest elves in Evermeet, back to a time 3,983 years before Dale Reckoning even began. In those ancient days, the forest you stand in was younger, wilder, and the elven people who dwelled within it were building something extraordinary under the guidance of Cornel Cavworm Irithyll. They raised towers not of stone alone, but of magic woven into the very essence of the trees themselves. They called forth the Rule Tower, a structure of such beauty and power that it would serve as the heart of their civilization for millennia to come. The elves of Cormanthor, as the kingdom was known, were not simply dwelling in the forest. They were part of it, interwoven with its roots and branches, its streams and glades. They understood magic in ways that other races could scarcely comprehend, not as a tool to be wielded, but as a living force to be harmonized with, to be respected, to be loved. For thousands of years, Cormanthor grew slowly, carefully, as all elven works do. There was no rush, no desperate scramble for power or expansion. The elves had time, centuries upon centuries of it, and they used that time to perfect their craft, their art, their understanding of the world around them. But you must understand something crucial about this period. Cormanthor, for all its beauty and magic, was an elven city. It was built by elves for elves, according to elven traditions and elven ways. The other races of Faerûn, the humans with their brief, burning lives, the dwarves with their love of stone and forge, the halflings with their simple joys, the gnomes with their endless curiosity. They were not part of this grand design. They were not unwelcome, precisely, but neither were they truly invited into the heart of what the elves were building. The forest of Cormanthor was vast, and humans did settle around its edges in the lands that would become known as the Dalelands. But there was a separation, an understanding that some spaces belonged to one people and not to others. This separation might have continued forever. The elves might have remained in their forest kingdom, perfecting their magic and their art in isolation, while the humans and other races built their own civilizations beyond the trees. But history, as you will see, had other plans. Change came, as it always does, and it came in the form of a vision, a dream of something greater than what had come before. In the year 261 Dale Reckoning, a transformation occurred that would alter the course of history for all the races of Faerûn. The coronal of Cormanthor, the elven ruler whose name was Eltargrim Irithyle, looked out upon the world and saw something that many of his people could not or would not see. He saw that isolation, no matter how beautiful, no matter how magically advanced, was ultimately a limitation. He saw that the other races, particularly the humans who had spread throughout the Dalelands surrounding the great forest, were not enemies to be kept at arm's length, but potential partners, potential friends, potential contributors to something even more magnificent than what the elves alone could create. This was not an easy vision to embrace. Among the elves, there were many who believed that their ways were perfect as they were, that opening their city to outsiders would dilute their culture, corrupt their magic, and ultimately destroy everything they had built over millennia. There were debates that lasted for years, arguments that echoed through the great halls of Cormanthor, passionate defenses of tradition against equally passionate pleas for change. You can imagine yourself standing in those halls, listening to voices raised in concern and in hope, feeling the weight of a decision that would reshape the world. But Coronel Eltargrim held firm to his vision. He proposed something radical, something that had never been attempted before on such a scale. He would forge a compact with the human settlers of the Dalelands, an agreement that would bind elves and humans together in mutual respect and cooperation. More than that, he would open the gates of Cormanthor itself, inviting humans and dwarves and halflings and gnomes to come not as visitors or temporary guests, but as true citizens, as equals in the building of something new. The Dale's Compact was formalized in that same year, 261 Dale Reckoning. And to mark this momentous occasion, Coronel Eltargrim raised the standing stone. Picture yourself standing before this marker, a monolith of stone placed deliberately near what would become known as Battledale. This was not merely a boundary marker or a monument to elven power. This was a promise carved in stone, a declaration that the age of separation was ending and a new age of cooperation was beginning. The standing stone represented hope, trust and the belief that different peoples could come together and create something greater than the sum of their parts. And to symbolize this transformation completely, the city itself was renamed. No longer would it be known simply as Cormanthor, the elven city in the forest. From that day forward, it would bear a new name, a name that spoke to its new purpose and its new identity. It would be called Drannor, which in the Elvish tongue means the myth of peace, or some say, the promise of harmony. The name itself was a statement of intent, a declaration that this city would be different, that it would stand as living proof that the races of Faerûn could set aside their differences and build together. You must try to imagine what this meant, what it felt like for those first humans who walked through the gates of Drannor as true citizens rather than outsiders. For thousands of years, the secrets of elven magic, the beauty of elven art, the wisdom of elven lore had been largely kept within the elven communities. Now, suddenly, those gates were opening. Human wizards could study alongside elven high mages. Dwarven craftsmen could collaborate with elven artisans. The knowledge that had been accumulated over millennia was being offered, shared, given freely in the hope that such sharing would enrich everyone. And it was not a one-way exchange. The elves, for all their accumulated wisdom and magical prowess, discovered that the other races had much to offer as well. Humans brought their innovation, their adaptability, their passionate drive to accomplish much in their brief lifespans. Dwarves brought their understanding of stone and metal, their engineering expertise, their steadfast reliability. Halflings brought their joy, their community spirit, their ability to find happiness in simple things. Gnomes brought their inventiveness, their curiosity, their endless desire to tinker and improve and discover. The city began to change, to grow in new directions. Structures that blended elven grace with dwarven solidity began to appear. Magic that combined elven intuition with human creativity started to flourish. The streets of Drannor, which had once echoed only with elvish voices singing in their ancient tongue, now rang with a multitude of languages, a chorus of different peoples, all working toward a common dream. But you should not imagine that this transformation happened easily or without difficulty. There were tensions, of course there were. Cultural misunderstandings, disagreements about how things should be done, resentments from those who felt that the old ways were being abandoned too quickly. Some elves left the city entirely, unable to accept the changes. In the year 262 Dale Reckoning, just 1 year after the opening, 5 major noble houses, Baraclaev, Hishanth, Rivern, Starim, and Telenin, plus several minor families and numerous individuals, quit Drannor for purely elven holdings in Cormanthor and elsewhere, and some humans, dwarves, and others found the elven ways strange, frustrating, incomprehensible at times. Yet despite these challenges, despite the growing pains of such a radical experiment, Drannor persisted. The vision held. Leaders from all races worked tirelessly to bridge the gaps, to facilitate understanding, to create systems and structures that honored all traditions while building something new. Slowly, gradually, the city found its rhythm, its identity as a truly multicultural, multiracial civilization. You walk these streets now in your mind during these early years after the transformation. You see elven mages in their flowing robes, walking beside human merchants, carrying goods from distant lands. You see dwarven smiths working in forges designed with both elven aesthetics and dwarven practicality. You hear the laughter of halfling children playing in gardens, tended by gnomish gardeners who have developed new, magical varieties of flowers that bloom in colors never seen before. You feel the energy, the excitement, the sense that something truly special is being created here. The city's architecture reflected this blending of cultures. The organic, flowing structures favored by the elves, buildings that seemed to grow from the trees themselves, began to incorporate elements of other styles. Dwarven arches provided strength and grandeur. Human designs added practicality and innovation. The result was a cityscape unlike anything else in Faerûn, a place where magic and craftsmanship, nature and civilization, tradition and innovation all existed in harmony. And at the center of it all stood Castle Cormanthor, the ancient heart of the city, the seat of power and wisdom. The castle had stood for thousands of years, but now it took on new significance. It became a symbol of unity, a place where leaders from all races could gather, where decisions affecting everyone could be made with input from everyone. The Rule Tower, that first great magical structure summoned millennia ago, still rose above everything else, a reminder of the city's ancient elven roots, even as it watched over the new, diverse civilization growing beneath it. The fields and forests surrounding Drannor also transformed. Elven rangers worked with human farmers to develop new agricultural techniques that respected the natural world while providing abundant food. Magical enhancements, carefully applied, ensured that the land remained fertile and healthy. The forest itself seemed to respond to the positive energy of cooperation, growing even more vibrant and beautiful. Trade began to flourish as never before. Merchants from across Faerûn, hearing of this unprecedented city where all races lived together, came to see for themselves and to participate in the economic opportunities such diversity created. Goods from elven craftsmen, prized for their beauty and magical properties, became more available. Dwarven weapons and armor, enhanced with elven enchantments, became legendary. Human innovations in everything from agriculture to architecture spread outward from Drannor to other lands. But perhaps most importantly, knowledge began to flow freely. The elves, who had guarded their magical secrets for millennia, started to teach openly. Schools were established, not just for elves, but for anyone with the talent and desire to learn. human students discovered that they could learn Elven methods of spell weaving. Elven students found that human approaches to magic, while different from their own traditions, offered valuable insights and new possibilities. The exchange of knowledge accelerated, and magic itself began to evolve in new directions. This was the promise of Myth Drannor. This was the vision that Coronel Eltargrim had dreamed of. A city where differences were not sources of conflict, but sources of strength. A place where cooperation replaced suspicion, where sharing replaced hoarding, where unity replaced division. It was an idealistic vision, perhaps even a naive one, but for a time, for a precious window of history, it seemed to be working. You stand in the center of the city now, in these early years of its transformation, and you look around at what is being built. You see hope made manifest in stone and spell. You see the future taking shape, a future where all the races of Faerûn might live together in peace and mutual enrichment. The air itself seems charged with possibility, with the sense that anything might be achieved if people of good will work together. The city was not yet at its height, not yet the legendary center of magic and culture that it would become. That would take more time, more work, more dedication from thousands of individuals, giving their best efforts to this grand experiment. But the foundation was being laid, the vision was being pursued, and the city of song was beginning to find its voice. Little did anyone know, in those hopeful early days, what darkness was already beginning to stir in the depths below and the shadows beyond. Little did they suspect that the very things that made Myth Drannor special, its openness, its magic, its idealism, would also make it a target for forces that hated everything it represented. But that knowledge lies ahead, in the sections of this story yet to be told. For now, in this moment, you simply witness the birth of something remarkable. You see Myth Drannor as it was meant to be, as it could be, as it briefly was. A city of peace standing proud in the heart of the ancient forest. A beacon of hope for all of Faerûn. Section 2. The Golden Age of Wonder. The years that followed the opening, as it came to be known, were unlike anything Faerûn had witnessed before or would witness again. You walk forward now through time, moving beyond the early hopeful days of cooperation into an era when those hopes blossomed into reality beyond anyone's wildest imaginings. The city of Myth Drannor did not merely survive its transformation from elven enclave to multiracial metropolis. It thrived, it soared. It became something so magnificent that even now, more than a millennium after its fall, the mere mention of its name evokes wonder and longing in the hearts of scholars, mages, and dreamers across all the realms. But before you can truly understand the heights to which Myth Drannor rose, you must first comprehend the single greatest magical achievement ever wrought by mortal hands. You must understand the Mythal. Stand with me now in the year 261 Dale Reckoning, the same year as the opening, and witness something that would define not just a city, but an entire age of magical possibility. The greatest high mages of Cormanthor, Elven wizards whose mastery of the arcane arts had been honed over centuries of study and practice, gathered together for a working of magic so complex, so powerful, so unprecedented that even they could not be entirely certain it would succeed. The Mythal was not simply a spell, though calling it such does no justice to its true nature. Imagine instead a living field of magical energy, woven into the very fabric of reality itself, anchored to a specific location, and designed to persist indefinitely without requiring constant maintenance or renewal. The elves had created mythals before, in other locations, other cities, but never one quite like this. The Mythal of Myth Drannor was designed from its inception to serve a multiracial population, to enhance and protect not just elves, but all who dwelled within the city in peace. The creation of the Mythal required the combined efforts of dozens of high mages working in perfect harmony. You watch them as they gather in a great circle, their voices rising in complex incantations that seem to resonate with the fundamental forces of magic itself. The air shimmers and ripples around them. The ground beneath your feet thrums with power. Trees surrounding the ritual site begin to glow with an inner light, as if responding to the magic being woven. The process takes days, the mages working in shifts, maintaining the spell pattern without pause, adding layer upon layer of enchantment, weaving together protective wards and beneficial effects into a work of magic so intricate that no single mage, no matter how skilled, could hope to comprehend it entirely. And then, in a moment of triumph and terror combined, the Mythal snaps into place. You feel it as a wave of energy washing over you, through you, a sensation that is neither painful nor entirely comfortable, but definitely profound. The Mythal is active, alive, a semi-sentient magical construct that will from this moment forward watch over Myth Drannor and all who dwell within its boundaries. What did the Mythal do? The question barely scratches the surface of its capabilities. At its most basic level, the Mythal provided protection, creating a magical barrier that made it extremely difficult for hostile forces to enter the city through teleportation or other magical means. Any attempt to use transportation magic to bypass the city's defenses would be detected, redirected, or simply fail. This alone would have made Myth Drannor one of the most defensible locations in all Faerûn. But the Mythal offered so much more. Within the boundaries of the Mythal, magic itself functioned differently. Beneficial spells were enhanced, their effects strengthened, and their durations extended. A healing spell that might normally mend minor wounds could, under the Mythal's influence, cure more serious injuries. A protective ward that would usually last for hours might persist for days. Even simple cantrips, the most basic exercises of magical talent, gained additional potency when cast within Myth Drannor's borders. For wizards, sorcerers, clerics, and all who wielded magic, the city became a place of amplified power, where their arts could achieve things impossible elsewhere. But the Mythal's most remarkable feature, the one that truly set it apart from all other such constructs, was its ability to grant limited magical abilities to those who dwelled within the city, even if they possessed no innate magical talent of their own. A human farmer living in Drannor for a sufficient period might find himself able to conjure light with a thought, or purify water with a gesture. A dwarven smith could discover that his hammer blows carried just a hint of magical enhancement, making his work subtly superior to what he could achieve elsewhere. These were not great powers, not the ability to hurl lightning or reshape reality, but they were real, tangible magical gifts bestowed by the city itself upon its citizens. The Mythal also influenced the environment within its boundaries in subtle but profound ways. Plants grew more vibrantly, their colors more vivid, their yields more abundant. The air itself seemed clearer, cleaner, carrying scents of flowers and forest that refreshed rather than overwhelmed. Water from the city's fountains and wells tasted pure and sweet, possessing faint restorative properties. Diseases found it harder to take hold in Drannor, and injuries healed more quickly. The city was not a place of immortality or perfect health. Suffering and death still existed within its borders, but it was a place where life itself seemed enhanced, enriched, elevated. And beneath all these practical benefits, the Mythal served a symbolic purpose as well. It was a statement carved in magical force that unity was not just possible, but powerful. The Mythal could only have been created through cooperation, and it served to protect and enhance a cooperative society. It was both the product of Drannor's ideals and the foundation upon which those ideals could be fully realized. With the Mythal in place, the city entered its true golden age, a period lasting several centuries, during which Drannor stood as the undisputed center of culture, learning, and magical achievement in all Faerûn. You walk the streets of the city now at the height of its glory, perhaps in the year 500 Dale reckoning, and everywhere you look you see wonders. The architecture alone would take your breath away. Towers that seemed impossibly slender rose hundreds of feet into the air, their walls formed from a fusion of living wood and shaped stone, Elven organic design, married to dwarven structural understanding. These towers glowed softly at night with their own inner light, not the harsh glare of torches or lanterns, but a gentle, warm radiance that made the entire city visible from miles away. A constellation of lights nestled in the heart of the forest. Bridges spanned the spaces between towers, some of solid construction, others formed from pure magical force, shimmering pathways of light that you could walk across as easily as stone. Gardens filled every available space, not wild forest, but carefully cultivated green areas where magical and mundane plants grew in harmonious profusion. Flowers that bloomed year-round despite the changing seasons, trees that bore fruit in every month, each harvest as abundant as the last. Fountains that sang, their falling water creating melodies that changed with the time of day and the season of the year. These were not merely decorative features, but examples of what could be achieved when Elven understanding of nature combined with gnomish innovation and human ambition. The streets themselves were works of art, paved with stones that had been individually shaped and placed to create intricate patterns. In some districts, the patterns were purely decorative, beautiful mosaics depicting scenes from Elven mythology or historical events. In others, the patterns served functional purposes, channeling magical energy or rainwater, creating pathways that would glow to guide travelers at night or warm themselves during winter to prevent ice formation. But the true glory of Myth Drannor was not in its physical structures, impressive though they were. The true glory lay in what happened within those structures, in the minds and hearts of the people who called the city home. Myth Drannor became the greatest center of learning in the known world, a place where knowledge was pursued with a passion and dedication that had never been seen before and would never be seen again. The city's libraries were legendary, vast repositories of knowledge accumulated over millennia. The great library of Cormanthor, which predated even the city's transformation, expanded enormously during the Golden Age as scholars from all races contributed their people's wisdom and lore. Human histories, dwarven technical manuals, halfling agricultural treatises, gnomish inventions, all were collected, copied, and preserved. But more than just preserving knowledge, the libraries of Myth Drannor became places where knowledge was created, where scholars from different traditions could compare their understanding and develop new insights. You enter one of these libraries and find yourself surrounded by more books, scrolls, and tablets than you could read in a dozen lifetimes. The air smells of parchment and ink, leather bindings, and preserved paper. Everywhere you look, people are reading, studying, debating. An elven sage argues gently with a human wizard about the proper methodology for summoning elementals. A dwarven historian compares notes with a halfling genealogist, discovering unexpected connections between their people's ancient past. A young gnome inventor sketches furiously, inspired by something she has read in a text written 3,000 years ago. The schools of magic in Myth Drannor were equally impressive. The city maintained multiple academies, each specializing in different approaches to the arcane arts. There were schools that taught traditional elven high magic, requiring decades of study to even begin to grasp the fundamentals. There were academies focused on the more intuitive, rapid casting style favored by human wizards. There were institutes devoted to the study of specific schools of magic, divination, illusion, evocation, each taught by masters of their craft. But what made these schools truly special was their openness and their willingness to blend traditions. An elven student might spend years learning the patient, methodical approach of high magic, then study under a human battle mage to understand how spells could be cast quickly under pressure. A human apprentice could learn the deep theoretical foundations from elven teachers, gaining understanding that would take their magic far beyond what raw talent alone could achieve. Dwarven students, rare but present, learned to combine their people's resistance to magic with active spellcasting, becoming uniquely effective as defensive casters. The schools did not just teach individuals, they conducted research, pushing the boundaries of what magic could accomplish. New spells were developed in Drannor with remarkable frequency during the height of the Golden Age. Innovations that would spread throughout Faerûn and remain in use for centuries after the city's fall. Magical items of unprecedented sophistication were crafted, combining multiple enchantments in ways that had never been attempted before. The city's artificers, working in teams that included elven enchanters, dwarven smiths, human designers, and gnomish innovators, created artifacts that would become legendary. The arts flourished alongside scholarship and magic. Drannor's theaters hosted performances that blended music, illusion, and genuine spellwork into experiences that transcended mere entertainment. You sit in one of these theaters, watching a performance of an elven epic poem. But the bard reciting the ancient words is accompanied by illusionists who make the scenes appear before your eyes in stunning detail. You watch armies clash, dragons soar, heroes triumph and fall, all while the measured cadence of the elvish verse washes over you. The emotional impact is overwhelming, a fusion of multiple art forms into something greater than any could achieve alone. Music filled the city constantly, earning Drannor one of its many epithets, the City of Song. Elven voices, trained over decades to achieve perfect pitch and control, harmonized with human singers whose passion and power could move listeners to tears. Dwarven drums provided rhythms that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the earth itself. Halfling flutes played melodies of simple joy that could lift the heaviest spirits. Gnomish inventors created entirely new instruments, devices that could produce sounds never heard before. And over it all, woven through it all, magic enhanced and amplified, creating symphonies that some claimed could be heard echoing from the city for miles around. Visual arts thrived as well. Painters, sculptors, weavers, all found inspiration and support in Drannor. Galleries displayed works in styles from every culture, elven paintings of ethereal beauty, hanging beside human portraits of stark realism. Dwarven sculptures of exquisite detail, positioned near halfling tapestries, celebrating the simple pleasures of hearth and home. Artists learned from each other, borrowed techniques, developed hybrid styles that belonged to no single race, but to Drannor itself. The economic prosperity of the city matched its cultural achievements. Trade flowed through Drannor from every corner of Faerûn and beyond. Merchants came seeking the city's magical goods, its enchanted items and spell scrolls, its potions and components. They came to trade in the works of art produced by the city's masters. They came for the knowledge contained in books copied by Drannor's scribes. And they brought wealth with them, wealth that the city used not to hoard, but to invest in further improvements, more schools, larger libraries, greater projects. The markets of Drannor were kaleidoscopes of color and sound and scent. You wander through them and find goods from across the world. Silks from distant Karatur, spices from the south, furs from the frozen north, gems from deep dwarven mines, all available for those with coin to spend. But more than material goods, you could trade in ideas, in knowledge, in opportunities. A human merchant might arrange to study in one of the city's libraries as partial payment for a shipment of rare books. An elven artisan might accept a dwarven apprentice in exchange for teaching the dwarfs master the secrets of a particular enchanting technique. The city's government during this period functioned as a complex but effective system of councils and advisors, with representation from all the major races and important factions. The coronal remained the ultimate authority, but that authority was exercised with wisdom and restraint, always seeking consensus rather than imposing dictates. When disputes arose, and they did despite the city's general harmony, they were resolved through discussion and compromise rather than force. The example set by the city's leadership filtered down through all levels of society, creating a culture where differences were seen as opportunities for growth rather than sources of conflict. The temples and shrines of Drannor reflected its multicultural nature. Elven deities like Corlin Larethian and Sehanine Moonbow were honored alongside human gods such as Mistra and Ogma. Dwarven shrines to Moradin stood not far from halfling spaces dedicated to Yondala. Clerics and priests of different faiths found that their deities, far from being in conflict, often had common ground, shared values, complementary perspectives. Theological discussions between clerics of different faiths became a regular feature of the city's intellectual life, enriching the understanding of all involved. The population grew steadily throughout the Golden Age, though never to the point of overcrowding, thanks to careful planning and the city's ability to expand both outward into the forest and upward with new towers. By the height of its power, Drannor was home to tens of thousands of souls, the majority still elven, but with substantial populations of humans, dwarves, halflings, gnomes, and even smaller numbers of rarer peoples like Aasimar and Genasi. Planetouched individuals drawn to the city's acceptance and its magical power. Children born in Drannor during this era grew up in an environment unlike any other in the world. An elven child and a human child might be playmates. the elf knowing that their friend would grow old and die, while they themselves remained young, but treasuring the friendship nonetheless. A dwarven youngster might apprentice to a gnomish craftsman, learning techniques that combined both people's traditions. The children of Myth Drannor were in many ways the truest embodiment of the city's ideals, growing up without the prejudices and assumptions that marked their parents' generations, seeing cooperation and friendship across racial lines as normal, natural, the way things should be. Yet even at the height of the Golden Age, even in the centuries when Myth Drannor seemed unassailable in its power and glory, there were shadows. Not everyone who left the city did so willingly. The noble houses that withdrew in 262 Dale reckoning, Barraclay of Hishanth, Revern, Starim, and Telenin, began documenting what they considered crimes against elven purity, maintaining records of every slight, every perceived insult, every instance where they believed elven ways were being compromised by association with other races. Their departure weakened the city politically to some degree, but it also removed a source of constant internal tension. Myth Drannor was better off without those who could not embrace its vision, or so most believed. But those departed houses did not simply fade away. They established themselves in other elven communities, in the Elven Court, in Evermeet when it was founded, and they remembered. They watched. They waited. There were external threats as well, though during the Golden Age most were successfully repelled or deterred. Raiders occasionally tested the city's defenses, drawn by its wealth and magical treasures. Each time they were turned back, sometimes by the Mythal itself, which could be commanded by the city's defenders to manifest more active protective measures, sometimes by the city's guards and wizards working in concert. These victories added to Myth Drannor's legendary status, but also increased the resentment of its enemies. In the depths below the city, in the Underdark that lay beneath the forest of Cormanthor, dark elves watched and schemed. The Drow had long memories and ancient grudges against their surface cousins. The success of Myth Drannor was an affront to them, a demonstration that elves working with other races could achieve greatness. It contradicted everything the Drow believed about the necessity of dominance and the weakness of cooperation. They began slowly and carefully to plan. Other forces took notice as well. Fiends in the lower planes saw Myth Drannor as an abomination, a place where law and chaos, good and evil, all mingled too freely, where the natural order of conflict and suffering was suspended in favor of harmony and growth. They could not allow such a place to persist indefinitely. It set a bad example. It suggested that mortals did not need the influence of the planes, that they could build paradise on their own. This could not stand. But these were distant threats, shadows on a far horizon. For the citizens of Myth Drannor living through the Golden Age, life was good, better than good. It was magnificent. They walked streets of wonder, pursued knowledge without limit, created beauty that would echo through the ages. They lived the dream that their leaders had articulated centuries before. The vision of what different peoples could accomplish together. The Golden Age lasted for centuries, generation after human generation, multiple elven lifetimes, an era that seemed as if it might never end. Myth Drannor stood proud and powerful, the city of song, the city of beauty, the myth of peace made manifest. It was a golden time indeed, an age of wonders that deserved to be remembered forever. But nothing lasts forever, not even the greatest civilizations. The shadows were gathering, drawing closer, and the sunset of Myth Drannor's glory was approaching, though few yet realized it. Section 3. The Shadows Gathering. The first cracks in the foundation appeared so subtly that few noticed them at the time. You stand now in the year 616 Dale Reckoning, and the air in Myth Drannor feels different somehow, though you would struggle to explain exactly how. The towers still gleam, the fountains still sing, the libraries remain filled with scholars pursuing knowledge. But something has changed. Something has been lost. Over the next several decades, the city would suffer 3 devastating losses of leadership that would shake its foundations and leave it vulnerable in ways that would not become fully apparent until it was far too late. The first loss came without warning, sudden and devastating in its impact on the city's collective spirit. Coronel Eltargrim Irithyle, the visionary leader who had opened Myth Drannor's gates to all races, who had championed the dream of unity and cooperation, fell in battle in the year 661 Dale Reckoning, while defending the realm he loved. You were not there to witness his final stand, but you hear the stories whispered in grief-stricken tones through the city's streets. He died as he lived, fighting for Cormanthor, protecting his people, believing until his last breath in the vision he had helped create. His death left a void in the city's leadership and in the hearts of all who had followed his dream. The second loss followed with cruel swiftness. Eltargrim's niece, a figure of grace and wisdom who had been expected to help guide the city through its grief, also fell. The details of her death are shrouded in sorrow and confusion, but the impact was unmistakable. 2 pillars of the city's leadership, 2 voices that had championed unity and understanding, silenced within a short span of time. The coincidence felt ominous, and whispers of conspiracy began to circulate through the taverns and gathering places. But the third loss, the one that would echo through the centuries and leave the deepest wound, was perhaps the most mysterious of all. The Srinchi, an ancient and powerful figure who had served Myth Drannor for longer than most could remember, had drawn the ruler's blade herself when no one else proved worthy after Eltargrim's death. This act suggests she may have taken on the role of coronel, or at least held the authority to rule, though the exact nature of her position remains unclear in the surviving records. What is certain is that she then withdrew from the city, retreating to a hidden place known only to a trusted few. She did not die, or at least no body was found, no funeral held. She left, departing without explanation to most, without farewell, without the guidance and wisdom she had provided for so long. Whatever the truth, her absence was felt immediately and profoundly. The Srinchi had been a stabilizing presence, a voice of ancient wisdom that could settle disputes and provide perspective when passions ran too hot. Without her, the city's various factions found it harder to find common ground, easier to let disagreements fester into genuine conflict. She had promised, or so the legend said, that she would return when myth Drannor faced its greatest need. Many held onto that promise like a lifeline, believing that surely such need would come and she would reappear to save them. But for now, for the critical decades ahead, the city would have to face its challenges without her. These 3 losses occurred within a span of just 60 years, a blink of an eye in Elven terms, but long enough for humans to live entire lives. What had taken millennia to build, what had been nurtured and perfected over countless generations, began to crack and crumble. The psychological impact on myth Drannor's citizens cannot be overstated. The sense of invulnerability, the belief that their city was blessed and protected by fate itself, began to erode. Doubt crept in where once there had been only confidence. The cracks widened as other problems emerged, problems that had perhaps always existed beneath the surface, but now became impossible to ignore. You notice that fewer elven faces walk the streets these days. At first, it is subtle, a family here, a household there, quietly packing their belongings and departing for other elven communities. But the trickle becomes a stream, and the stream threatens to become a flood. Elves are leaving myth Drannor, abandoning the great experiment, and each departure makes the next one easier to justify. The reasons are complex and varied. Some elves, particularly among the ancient noble families, had never truly accepted the opening, never embraced the vision of a multiracial city. They had tolerated it while Coronel Eltargrim lived, respecting his authority even when they disagreed with his choices. But with his death, their restraint began to slip away. They looked around and saw human families living in what had been elven homes, dwarven merchants conducting business in what had been exclusively elven markets, and they felt a profound sense of loss, a belief that their heritage was being diluted, their culture eroded by the presence of so many outsiders. Others left not out of prejudice, but out of simple weariness with the constant tensions. Living in a multiracial society required work, required patience and compromise, and the willingness to navigate misunderstandings and cultural differences. For immortal beings who could remember when the forest had belonged solely to their people, the effort sometimes felt too great. Why struggle to make things work here when they could retreat to the elven court, to Semberhome, or eventually to Evermeet across the sea, where they could live among their own kind without complication or conflict? The exodus was not limited to elves alone. Craftsmen of all races began to leave as well, drawn away by opportunities in newer, smaller settlements that offered less competition and more room for advancement. Hilsafar to the north, Moondale to the south. These and other communities actively recruited skilled workers from Drannor, offering generous terms and the chance to be important figures in growing towns, rather than just another face in the great city. The city's craft guilds, which had once been models of cooperation between different racial traditions, began to calcify, becoming rigid and hierarchical, making it harder for younger craftsmen to advance or innovate. As the skilled workers departed, as the elven population declined, something insidious began to happen. Wealthy humans and dwarves, seeing opportunities in the vacant properties, began buying up the homes and halls that elven families had abandoned. This was not illegal, not even particularly unethical in most cases. Fair prices were paid, legitimate transactions conducted, but the optics were terrible. To the remaining elves, it looked like humans were grabbing land, filling the spaces left by their departed kin, taking over neighborhoods that had been elven for thousands of years. The paranoia grew. Elves who had lived peacefully alongside human neighbors for decades suddenly saw them as threats, as invaders slowly conquering the city not with swords, but with gold. Never mind that many of these human families had been born in Drannor, had lived there for generations, considered it their home just as much as any elf did. The perception became more powerful than the reality, and perception drove more elves to leave, which created more vacant properties, which were bought by humans and dwarves, which increased the paranoia, a vicious cycle spiraling ever downward. The city's government began to fracture under these pressures. The Council of 12 Peers, which had functioned reasonably well for centuries, became a battleground of competing interests and mutual suspicions. Representatives from different racial groups accused each other of favoritism, of trying to grab power or resources for their own people at the expense of others. Debates that once would have been settled through calm discussion and compromise now devolved into shouting matches that resolved nothing. Arms Major Kelvin Allertinnel, commander of the Akfilar, the city's military forces, watched these developments with growing alarm. He was an elf of the old school, a warrior who took his oaths seriously. As the council fractured and paranoia grew, Kelvin became increasingly concerned about threats to the city, though the exact nature of his fears has been interpreted differently by various historians. What is certain is that he dramatically increased military preparedness, drilling his troops constantly, developing defensive strategies, and stockpiling weapons and supplies. Whether he feared attack from the elder houses who had withdrawn, invasion from external enemies, or simply believed in thorough preparation against any threat, his actions would prove invaluable when danger finally materialized. Even as internal tensions mounted, Even as the city struggled with its own divisions and fears, there were external threats gathering strength in the darkness beyond myth, Drannor's glowing towers. Some of these threats were ancient, predating the city itself, while others were new, drawn specifically by the city's wealth and power, and the resentment it generated among those who served darkness. Deep beneath the forest, in the Underdark's lightless passages and vast caverns, the Drow had been watching and planning for centuries. The Dark Elves despised their surface cousins with an intensity born of ancient betrayal and religious fanaticism. They served Lolt, the Spider Queen, a goddess who preached dominance and treachery, who rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. Everything myth Drannor represented, cooperation, trust, openness, harmony, was anathema to Drow culture. The city's very existence was an insult, a challenge that demanded a response. The Drow began probing the defenses years before the final assault, sending small raiding parties to test the surface elves' readiness, to map the tunnels and passages that led up from the depths. They captured prisoners when they could, interrogating them for information about the city's layout, its magical defenses, its political divisions. They learned about the Mythal and began researching ways to bypass or corrupt it. They made contact with other enemies of myth Drannor, forging alliances that would have seemed impossible under normal circumstances. In other dark places, other forces took notice of the shining city in the forest. Demon lords in the abyss saw myth Drannor as a prize worth claiming, a concentration of magical power and mortal souls ripe for corruption and destruction. Devils in the Nine Hells viewed it as a strategic target, a place whose fall would spread despair and chaos throughout the region, weakening the forces of good and law. Both fiends and devils began subtle manipulations, whispering in the dreams of mortals, corrupting vulnerable souls, preparing the groundwork for a more direct assault. Orc tribes in the surrounding regions, normally too disorganized to pose a serious threat, began to unite under unusually charismatic and intelligent war chief. Behind these leaders, unseen hands guided and directed, providing weapons and tactical advice, channeling the orcs' natural aggression toward a specific target. The orcs did not know or care who was manipulating them. They simply saw myth Drannor as the greatest collection of treasure and slaves in the region, a target worthy of any risk. But perhaps the most dangerous threat, the one that would prove pivotal in the city's ultimate fall, had actually been present for centuries, lurking unseen above the very towers and streets where citizens walked in blissful ignorance. You must travel back in time now, back nearly 2,000 years before these losses of leadership, to understand this particular shadow that hung over myth Drannor. In those ancient days, in the year -2110 Dale Reckoning, when the city was still called Cormanthor, and the opening had not yet been imagined, a Netherese archwizard named Aldlas Sodhis came to the Elven woods seeking power. Netheril, that empire of human wizards, whose magical might had once rivaled even the elves, was driven by an insatiable hunger for arcane knowledge. Aldlas sought the Nether Scrolls, legendary artifacts that contained the fundamental secrets of magic itself, and his research had led him to believe they were hidden somewhere in the forest. Unable to search safely himself in territory controlled by hostile elves, Aldlas summoned 3 powerful Yugoloth mercenaries from the lower plains. Yugoloths were creatures of pure evil, fiendish beings who sold their services to the highest bidder without loyalty or honor. The 3 he summoned were Nikoloths, greater Yugoloths of terrible power. Their names were Almpeter, Golgoth, and Malamshare, and together they became known as the Trio Nefarious, or in the Elven tongue, the Kav Analessa. Almpeter was the strategist, a brilliant tactical mind who could plan campaigns and manipulate others with frightening skill. Golgoth was the stealthy warrior, capable of appearing and disappearing like smoke, striking from unexpected angles with lethal precision. Malamshare was the berserker, a creature of pure destructive rage who reveled in carnage and chaos. Individually, each was a threat. Together, under Almpeter's direction, they were devastating. For 3 months, the trio rampaged through the Elven woods, destroying villages, slaughtering whole communities of satyrs and centaurs, killing even mighty green dragons that dwelt beneath Cormanthor's boughs. Hundreds died before the Elven defenders could organize an effective response. Aldlas himself accompanied the Yugoloths, believing he was controlling them, unaware that Almpeter was actually manipulating him as easily as he manipulated everyone else. Finally, the elves made their stand at the very borders of Cormanthor itself. High mages, bladesingers armed with powerful enchanted weapons, priests calling upon divine power, all united to stop the threat before it could reach the city's heart. The battle lasted an entire day, and Elven casualties were heavy, but in the end, they prevailed. Aldlas died when his own magic was turned against him, crushed by the arcane forces he had wielded. Golgoth and Malamshare were nearly slain, their essences barely clinging to the material plane. Almpeter was subdued, captured despite his formidable powers. But the elves faced a problem. Yugoloths could not truly be killed on the material plane. If destroyed, they would simply return to their home plane and eventually could be summoned again. Banishment was possible, but temporary. Binding them in some physical prison risked them eventually escaping or being freed by allies. The solution required the most powerful magic the elves possessed, a high magic ritual known as the En-Kor-Kar, the binding of eternal slumber. Coronel Mirfi's Irithyle, the high mages, and numerous priests combined their powers to create a unique prison for the 3 Yugoloths. It was a subdimensional space, a bubble of reality separated from normal existence, but still physically present above the city, invisible, undetectable by normal means. permeable to energy and matter from the outside, but utterly impenetrable from within. The Yugoloths were placed inside this prison with all their equipment and weapons, but rendered completely powerless, unable to use their abilities, unable to communicate with the outside world, unable even to return to their home plane. The prison floated high above Cormanthor, and later above Drannor when the city was renamed, for nearly 2,000 years. The Yugoloths remained trapped, conscious, but helpless, watching the city below them, watching it grow and transform, watching the opening occur and the Golden Age unfold. They witnessed everything, but could effect nothing. Their rage and hatred grew with each passing century, festering in the darkness of their prison, becoming a concentrated essence of malevolence aimed at the city that had caged them. The elves who created the prison believed it was permanent, unbreakable. They had used the most powerful magic available to ensure the Yugoloths could never escape. But magic, no matter how potent, is not truly eternal. The elves who knew the prison's exact location and nature died over the centuries. Records were lost or forgotten. By the time of these losses of leadership, few in Drannor even remembered the trio nefarious. They had become legend, a scary story told to children, monsters defeated long ago and of no current relevance. This was a fatal mistake. The Yugoloths were very real, very present, and very patient. And patience, in beings that measured time differently than mortals, was a weapon all its own. Other threats gathered as well, some dramatic and obvious, others subtle and insidious. Cults devoted to demon lords began appearing in the outlying communities, spreading corruption and preparing the ground for invasion. Ancient dragons, jealous of Drannor's magical treasures, began circling closer, probing for weaknesses. Liches and other undead abominations, drawn by the concentration of magical energy the Mythal represented, started moving toward the region. The churches within Drannor began to sense the gathering darkness. Priests of various deities reported troubling visions, prophetic dreams of fire and destruction. Divination spells produced ominous warnings that were frustratingly vague. Something terrible was coming. The signs all agreed on that, but the exact nature and timing remained unclear. The temples began quietly preparing, stockpiling healing supplies, training their followers in defensive magic and combat, reaching out to form alliances with each other across racial and theological lines. The Sranala, an order of elven mystics and warriors who had served Drannor for generations, also sensed the approaching storm. They believed absolutely that the Srinchi would return when the city faced its greatest need, and they prepared themselves to serve under her command when that time came. They maintained their disciplines, their training, their magical research, waiting for the call that they were certain would come. But not everyone prepared. Many citizens, caught up in their daily lives or distracted by the internal political struggles, refused to believe that anything truly catastrophic could happen to Drannor. The city had stood for over 3,000 years. It had weathered storms before. The Mythal protected them. The armies were strong. How could anything truly threaten the greatest city in all Faerûn? This complacency would prove deadly. As the year 700 Dale Reckoning approached, as the shadows continued to gather and coalesce, as disparate enemies began to communicate and coordinate, Drannor stood divided against itself, weakened by internal strife, its population declining, its government fractured. The city was not prepared for what was coming. How could it be, when the true scope of the threat remained hidden until it was far too late to mount an adequate defense? The Golden Age was ending, though many did not yet realize it. The sunset was approaching, and with it would come darkness deeper and more terrible than anything Drannor had ever faced. The shadows were no longer merely gathering. They were preparing to strike. And when they did, the world would never be the same. Section 4. The Weeping War Unleashed. The Feast of the Moon in the year 711 Dale Reckoning should have been a night of celebration. A time when the people of Drannor honored their ancestors and gave thanks for the harvest. Instead, it became the night when hope died and nightmare was born. You stand on the outskirts of the great forest, watching as the first reports come streaming in from the outlying settlements. Villages are burning. Entire communities have been slaughtered. Something vast and terrible is moving through Cormanthor, and it is coming from Drannor. The army of darkness, as it would come to be known, emerged from multiple directions simultaneously. A coordinated assault that spoke of careful planning and extensive preparation. You watch in horror as the reality of what is happening becomes clear. This is not a raid. This is not a probe or a test. This is total war, an attempt to utterly destroy the greatest city in Faerûn, and the forces arrayed against Drannor are unlike anything the city has faced before. From the deep Underdark tunnels came the drow, hundreds of dark elves armed with their poisoned crossbow bolts and deadly magic. They moved with purpose and coordination, their priestesses calling upon the power of Lolt, the Spider Queen, to bolster their warriors and summon arachnid horrors. These were not mere raiders seeking treasure and slaves. These were soldiers on a holy mission, determined to erase the stain of Drannor from the surface world. Their hatred was palpable, a living force that seemed to radiate from them like heat from a forge. From the mountains and badlands came the orcs, thousands upon thousands of them, united under warlords who wielded an intelligence and tactical acumen that orcs normally did not possess. Behind their yellow eyes and tusked faces lay a cunning that spoke of outside influence, of something or someone guiding them toward their target. They brought with them ogres and trolls, hill giants, and other brutish creatures, a horde of muscle and rage that could sweep aside normal defenses through sheer, overwhelming force. But the true horror, the element that transformed this from a dangerous invasion into an existential threat, came from the lower planes themselves. Demons poured through gates that had been secretly opened by cultists who had spent years preparing the way. These were not minor fiends, but powerful creatures, Mariliths with their 6 sword-wielding arms, Glabrezu with their crushing claws and terrible strength, Nalfishni, whose very presence could drive mortals mad with terror. They came not for conquest, but for destruction, for the sheer joy of ending something beautiful, of watching civilization burn and hearing the screams of the dying. Devils joined the assault as well, beings of law and evil, who normally would never cooperate with the chaotic demons, but who had been convinced that Myth Drannor represented a threat to the cosmic order that required temporary alliance. They brought their tactical genius, their discipline, their ability to coordinate complex operations. Where demons raged and destroyed, devils planned and executed, and together they formed a military force far more effective than either could have managed alone. And high above the gathering army, invisible to those below, the prison that held the trio, Nefarious, finally failed. After nearly 2,000 years of imprisonment, the magical bonds that held Almpeter, Golgoth, and Malamshare weakened just enough for the Yugoloths to break free. They emerged into the material world, consumed by a rage that had been building for millennia, focused entirely on the city that had caged them. They saw the army of darkness gathering below and immediately took command, bringing their terrible powers and ancient cunning to bear in organizing the assault. Almpeter, always the strategist, began coordinating the disparate forces with masterful skill. He placed the drow where their stealth and magic would be most effective. He positioned the orc hordes where their numbers could overwhelm defenses. He directed demons and devils to specific targets where their unique abilities would cause maximum disruption. Under his guidance, what might have been a chaotic mob became a deadly military machine. Golgoth, the shadowy warrior, took to infiltrating Myth Drannor itself, appearing and disappearing like smoke, striking at key defenders when they least expected it, spreading fear and confusion throughout the city's ranks. His ability to move unseen made him nearly impossible to counter. A ghost that could materialize anywhere, kill, and vanish before reinforcements could arrive. Malamshare, the berserker, led from the front lines, his rage inspiring the demons and orcs to greater heights of violence. Where he walked, destruction followed. His mere presence on the battlefield could turn the tide of an engagement, his terrible strength and fury cutting through defenders like a scythe through wheat. The first battles occurred far from Myth Drannor itself, in the outlying settlements and villages that dotted the forest. These communities never had a chance. The army of darkness swept over them like a wave, killing everyone they found, burning structures, desecrating sacred groves, leaving nothing but corpses and ash in their wake. Elven rangers who tried to mount a defense were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Human farmers who took up arms to protect their families died alongside them. The mining camps on the western Moonsea were completely overrun, their populations slaughtered to the last soul. Arms Major Kelvin Allertinnel, whose preparations had seemed excessive just months before, suddenly found his worst fears realized, and his military forces inadequately prepared despite all his efforts. He had trained his troops for combat, yes, but for combat against other mortals, against possible attacks from rival kingdoms or organized armies. He had not prepared for war against fiends, against creatures whose very nature violated the normal rules of existence. His soldiers were brave and skilled, but bravery and skill meant little when facing enemies who could teleport behind your lines, who were immune to normal weapons, who could kill with a glance or a touch. The Akfair myth, Drannor's legendary army of elven blade singers and warriors, mobilized immediately. These were among the finest fighters in all Faerûn, elves who had trained for decades or centuries in the art of combining swordplay with spellcasting, who could dance through combat like deadly poets, weaving steel and magic into deadly harmony. They marched out to meet the enemy with confidence born of long years of victory, certain that their skill and the righteousness of their cause would prevail, as it always had before. They were wrong. The army of darkness met them in open battle and destroyed them, not through superior skill, but through overwhelming force, and the simple fact that fiends did not fight fair. When elven warriors closed for melee combat, demons teleported away and attacked from range. When the elves spread out to avoid area attacks, devils coordinated strikes that isolated and overwhelmed individual soldiers. When the Bladesingers tried to use their magic to turn the tide, Yugoloth counterspells disrupted their casting. The Akfair fought with everything they had, and they died by the hundreds, their bodies littering the forest floor, their songs of war cut short by demonic claws and poisoned blades. The survivors fell back toward Myth Drannor, conducting a fighting retreat that cost them dearly with every mile. Behind them, the army of darkness advanced methodically, destroying everything in its path. The forest of Cormanthor, ancient and beautiful, began to burn. Flames leaped from tree to tree, consuming millennia of growth in hours. The smoke rose in great black columns that could be seen from Myth Drannor itself, a grim reminder of what was coming. Inside the city, panic began to set in as refugees from the outlying areas streamed through the gates with tales of slaughter and destruction. The citizens who had believed their city invulnerable now faced the reality that something terrible was coming for them, something that their vaunted defenses might not be able to stop. The Council of 12 Peers, which had spent recent years mired in petty disputes and factional infighting, suddenly had to function as an actual government facing an existential crisis. To their credit, they rose to the occasion. Old grudges were set aside, at least temporarily. as representatives from all races worked together to prepare the city's defenses. The Mythal, that great magical construct that had protected Drannor for centuries, was activated to its fullest defensive capabilities. The high mages who maintained it poured power into its wards, strengthening the barriers against teleportation, enhancing the protective fields around the city, preparing the Mythal to actively strike at enemies who approached too closely. But they discovered to their horror that the Mythal, powerful as it was, had limitations. It had been designed primarily to defend against magical intrusion, not against a massive ground assault by an army that included beings specifically designed to corrupt and destroy magical constructs. The temples mobilized their resources, turning their sanctuaries into field hospitals and their priests into combat medics. Clerics of Corellin Larethian, Mistra, Lathander, and a dozen other deities worked side by side, healing the wounded, blessing weapons, providing spiritual support to terrified citizens. The priests knew that if Drannor fell, their temples would be desecrated, and they themselves would be prime targets for the fiend's rage. They had every reason to fight with everything they had. The city's wizards, who normally spent their time in research and teaching, found themselves drafted into military service. Entire academies worth of mages took to the walls, preparing spells of destruction and defense, crafting magical items that could give ordinary soldiers a chance against supernatural foes. The schools of magic that had been centers of learning and enlightenment transformed overnight into weapons factories, churning out scrolls and potions, enchanting arrows and blades, doing everything possible to give the defenders an edge. The year 711 Dale Reckoning ended with Drannor under siege, but still standing. The army of darkness had swept aside the outer defenses and now surrounded the city on all sides, but the walls held and the Mythal continued to function. Inside the city, the defenders caught their breath and prepared for the next assault. They had survived the initial onslaught. Surely they could hold out until reinforcements arrived from other Elven communities, from Evermeet, from the human kingdoms that owed Drannor debts of friendship and trade. But reinforcements were not coming. The other Elven communities were too distant or too weak to offer meaningful help. Evermeet, across the sea, could not mobilize forces quickly enough. The human kingdoms, facing their own problems and not fully understanding the scope of what was happening, offered sympathy but little practical aid. Drannor stood alone against the darkness, and slowly, inexorably, that darkness was closing in. The year 712 Dale Reckoning brought more desperate fighting. The army of darkness probed the city's defenses constantly, seeking weaknesses, testing different approaches. Demons hurled themselves against the walls in frenzied assaults, dying in droves to elven arrows and wizard fire, but learning with each attack where the defenses were strongest and where they might be breached. Devils conducted more methodical operations, tunneling under walls, using magic to corrode protective wards, slowly grinding down the defenders through attrition. Inside the city, resources began to run low. Food supplies that had seemed adequate for a normal siege dwindled faster than expected as the population swelled with refugees. And as magical preservation spells failed under the strain of constant use, water remained plentiful thanks to the Mythal's enhancements, but other necessities grew scarce. Arrows ran out despite frantic efforts to manufacture more. Spell components became rare and precious. Healing potions were rationed strictly, reserved for the most serious wounds. The city that had once been wealthy beyond measure now faced genuine scarcity. And with scarcity came tension and the resurgence of old divisions. The Harpers, that secret organization of bards and rangers dedicated to preserving knowledge and fighting tyranny, suffered catastrophic losses during this year. A group known as the Harpers at Twilight, based in and around Drannor, had numbered over 100 members at the war's beginning. They conducted raids behind enemy lines, gathered intelligence, sabotaged army of darkness supply lines, and performed countless acts of heroism. By the end of 712 Dale Reckoning, fewer than a dozen Harpers at Twilight remained alive. The rest had fallen in combat or been captured and suffered fates too terrible to describe. Their sacrifice slowed the enemy advance and bought precious time for the city. But the cost was nearly the complete destruction of their organization in the region. Heroes emerged during this dark time, individuals whose courage and skill shone like beacons in the surrounding gloom. You hear their names whispered in the streets, spoken with reverence and hope. Elven bladesingers who single-handedly held crucial positions against overwhelming odds. Human wizards who exhausted themselves casting protective spells over refugee columns. Dwarven warriors who led desperate counterattacks that recovered lost ground. Halfling scouts who infiltrated enemy camps and returned with vital intelligence. Every race contributed heroes, and every hero knew they were likely marching toward death. Yet they went anyway because Drannor was worth dying for. But heroes alone could not stem the tide. As the year 713 Dale Reckoning began, the situation grew increasingly desperate. The army of darkness had learned the city's defenses intimately and began exploiting every weakness. Portions of the outer wall were breached, forcing desperate hand-to-hand fighting in the streets themselves. Demons penetrated into the city proper, requiring valuable resources to hunt down and eliminate. The Mythal, strained beyond anything its creators had envisioned, began to show signs of corruption as fiendish magic worked constantly to degrade and pervert its functions. It was during this year that the defenders finally managed a significant victory. Through a combination of skill, sacrifice, and desperate bravery, a team of heroes managed to hunt down and destroy 2 of the 3 Nikoloths leading the army of darkness. Golgoth, the shadowy assassin, was cornered in the ruins of a burned district and destroyed after a battle that killed half the heroes who confronted him. Malimshare, the berserker, was lured into a trap and subjected to such overwhelming magical assault that even his tremendous resilience could not save him. His essence was banished back to the lower planes, removed from the conflict. The destruction of two of the trio Nefarious should have been a turning point. With their leaders diminished, the army of darkness should have lost cohesion and effectiveness. But Amphitrite remained, and he alone was nearly as dangerous as all three had been together. The master strategist adapted to the loss of his companions, reorganizing his forces, changing tactics, proving that he did not need them to achieve his ultimate goal. If anything, their deaths seemed to focus his rage and determination. He would see Drannor destroyed, whatever the cost. The defenders fought on through 713 Dale Reckoning, knowing that they were losing but refusing to surrender. Every street became a battlefield, every building a potential fortress. The beautiful city of towers and gardens was transformed into a war zone of rubble and blood. The fountains that had sung now ran red. The gardens that had bloomed year-round were trampled and burned. The towers that had glowed with gentle light were shattered or stood dark and empty, their inhabitants fled or dead. And through it all, the Mythal continued to degrade. The great magical construct that had defined Drannor, that had made it special and unique, was being corrupted by sustained fiendish influence. The wards that had kept enemies out began to fail. The enhancements that had blessed citizens began to twist into curses. The Mythal was not dead, but it was dying, and its death throes were nearly as dangerous as the enemy army outside the walls. As the year 714 Dale Reckoning began, everyone in Drannor knew the end was coming. The only questions were when, and how many would survive to tell the tale. The greatest city in Faerûn had perhaps months left, maybe only weeks. The dream that had sustained it for centuries was ending in fire and blood, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Section 5, The Final Flight. The spring of 714 Dale Reckoning arrived with unseasonable cold, as if the world itself mourned what was about to occur. You stand on the walls of Drannor and look out at the army of darkness surrounding the city on all sides, and you know with absolute certainty that these are the final days. The question is no longer whether the city will fall, but how many will escape to tell its story. How much knowledge can be saved from the flames, and whether anything of Drannor's dream will survive the nightmare that is consuming it. The defenders are exhausted beyond measure. They have been fighting for nearly 3 years with almost no respite, 3 years of constant vigilance, of sleeping in armor, of watching friends and loved ones die, of seeing the beautiful city they called home transformed into a charnel house. The human soldiers, who began this war as young men and women full of vigor, are now hollow-eyed shadows of themselves, aged beyond their years by stress and horror. The elven warriors, normally so composed and graceful, move with mechanical precision that speaks of deep trauma. Their faces blank masks hiding wells of grief too deep for expression. The dwarven defenders, stubborn to the last, continue to hold their positions. But even their legendary endurance has limits, and those limits are rapidly approaching. The Mythal, once the greatest magical achievement in all of Faerûn, is dying. You can feel it in the air, a wrongness that makes your skin crawl and your teeth ache. The protective wards flicker and fail at random intervals. The enhancements that once blessed the city now produce unpredictable and sometimes dangerous effects. Spells cast within the Mythal's boundaries behave erratically, sometimes working as intended, sometimes producing completely different results, occasionally backfiring catastrophically on the caster. The high mages who maintain the Mythal work desperately to shore up its failing structure, but they are fighting a losing battle. The sustained assault by fiendish magic, combined with the physical presence of so many extraplanar beings within its boundaries, has corrupted the Mythal's fundamental nature. It cannot be saved. The only question is whether it will die slowly or collapse catastrophically, and whether its death will take the entire city with it. The Council of 12 Peers, reduced now to only 8 members, as the others have fallen in battle or fled in despair, meets in the ruins of what was once the Grand Council Chamber. The beautiful hall where representatives from all races had debated policy and forged consensus is now a damaged shell. Its ceiling partially collapsed, its walls scorched by fire and scarred by claw marks. The remaining counselors sit in chairs that don't match, surrounded by maps and reports detailing nothing but disaster. And they face the hardest decision any government has ever had to make. They must decide when to order the evacuation, when to officially abandon the greatest city in the world, and tell its citizens to run for their lives. The city's leadership, what remains of it after 3 years of devastating war, looks at the assembled counselors with eyes that have seen too much death. The burden of command during this catastrophe has marked all of them visibly. Those who survived bear signs of their ordeal, hair gone white, faces lined with care, bodies bearing scars that will never fully heal. They speak in voices that shake only slightly, proposing what everyone in the room knows must be done, but none want to say aloud. The evacuation must begin immediately. Not a gradual withdrawal, not a careful phased retreat, but a full exodus of everyone who can walk or be carried. The city cannot hold for another month, perhaps not even another week. Those who wish to survive must leave now. The vote is unanimous, though several counselors weep as they cast their approval. Orders go out immediately through what remains of the city's command structure. Evacuate to the Elven Court, to Semberhome, to any Elven community that can be reached. Take only what you can carry. Leave the treasures, leave the art, leave everything but your lives, and whatever knowledge you can preserve. The libraries, those vast repositories of wisdom accumulated over millennia, must be abandoned with most of their contents intact. There is simply no way to move so many books, scrolls, and tablets in the time available. The mages do what they can, grabbing the most valuable texts, the irreplaceable grimoires, the unique historical documents. But they know that 90% or more of the city's accumulated knowledge will be left behind for the flames and the demons. You watch as the evacuation begins in the pre-dawn darkness. The gates on the eastern side of the city, the side farthest from the main concentration of enemy forces, open quietly. The first groups slip out, moving as silently as possible, hoping to avoid detection for as long as they can. These are the most vulnerable civilians, the elderly and the very young, those who cannot fight and who will slow down any group they travel with. They are given the best chance of escape by leaving first, along with escorts of rangers and scouts who know the forest paths and who might be able to guide them to safety. Behind them come the skilled craftsmen, the scholars, the merchants, anyone whose skills will be needed to rebuild elsewhere. They carry what tools they can, what books they manage to save, the seed stock for a new beginning in a new place. Many weep silently as they leave, looking back at the city that has been their home, knowing they will never see it again, except perhaps in dreams. The artists leave, carrying instruments and partially finished works. The poets who had sung myth, Drannor's glory, and who now must compose its eulogy. The teachers depart, many of them leading groups of students who are too young to understand the full scope of what is being lost. The priests and clerics from the various temples organize their own evacuations, carrying sacred relics and texts, ensuring that the religious traditions preserved in Myth Drannor will survive even if the city does not. But not everyone leaves. As the evacuation proceeds, as thousands stream out through the eastern gates toward whatever uncertain future awaits them, others make a different choice. You see them gathering, these warriors and mages who have decided that if Myth Drannor must fall, it will not fall cheaply. They will stay behind and fight to the last, buying time with their lives for the evacuees to escape, ensuring that the army of darkness pays the highest possible price for its victory. These volunteers know they are committing suicide, that there is no scenario in which they survive. But they do it anyway, because some things matter more than survival. Arms Major Kelvin Allertinnel is among those who stay. The military commander who had prepared so obsessively for war, who had been proven grimly correct in his assessments, now prepares for his final battle. He organizes the remaining defenders into groups that will hold key positions as long as possible. The main gates must stay in friendly hands to allow the evacuation to continue. The bridges and choke points must be defended to slow the enemy advance. The Mythal's anchor points must be protected to prevent the enemy from corrupting them completely, at least until the evacuees are safely away. The Akfair, that legendary army of elven warriors, has been reduced to a mere fraction of its former strength. But those who remain are among the finest fighters to ever walk Faerûn. They take position along the walls and in the streets, prepared to sell their lives as expensively as possible. Human battle mages stand alongside them, staffs and wands ready, knowing that the spells they are about to cast will be their last. Dwarven axe wielders plant their feet and prepare to create walls of enemy corpses before they fall. Halfling slingers find elevated positions where they can do maximum damage before being overwhelmed. The Sranala, those elven mystics who had believed absolutely that the Srinchi would return when Myth Drannor faced its greatest need, now face the crushing realization that she is not coming, that they will face this final battle without her guidance. Some break under the weight of that betrayal, fleeing with the evacuees, or simply giving up in despair. But others find new resolve, deciding that if the Srinchi will not save Myth Drannor, they will honor her memory by fighting to the end with everything they have. They join the defenders on the walls, wielding magic and blade in a final desperate stand. The army of darkness notices the increased activity, realizes that something has changed. Almpeter, the last surviving member of the trio Nefarious, orders a full assault. There will be no more probing attacks, no more careful tactical maneuvers. The time for subtlety has passed. He sends everything, demons and devils, drow and orcs, giants and trolls, every creature under his command, in a massive coordinated strike designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer weight of numbers and power. The final battle for Myth Drannor begins at dawn on a day in late spring, though later no one will remember the exact date. Time loses meaning in the chaos and horror of what follows. You stand with the defenders and watch as a tide of evil crashes against the city's walls like a wave against a cliff. The noise is indescribable, a cacophony of screams and roars, of steel on steel, of magical detonations and collapsing stone. The smell is worse, blood and smoke, and the sulphurous stench of fiends, thick enough to choke on. The defenders fight with the courage of the doomed, and they fight magnificently. Elven archers on the walls send arrow after arrow into the approaching horde, each shot perfectly placed, each finding a vital target. When their arrows run out, they draw swords and continue fighting in melee. Human wizards chaincast spells of destruction, fireballs and lightning bolts, and more exotic magics, expending their lives' energy in one final explosive effort. When their spells are exhausted, they take up weapons they barely know how to use and fight on. Dwarven warriors hold choke points against impossible odds, their axes rising and falling in tireless rhythm, creating barricades of enemy dead. When their strength finally fails, when their muscles can no longer lift their weapons, they still refuse to fall back. using their own bodies as obstacles. The battle rages through the day and into the night, illuminated by fires burning across the city and by the flickering, dying light of the corrupted Mythal. The defenders give ground slowly, street by street, building by building, making the army of darkness pay for every foot of advance. Behind them, the evacuation continues. Thousands of civilians fleeing into the forest, running for their lives, while their protectors buy them time with blood. The Mythal begins to collapse not all at once, but in stages, its various functions failing sequentially as the corruption reaches critical levels. First, the teleportation wards fall completely, allowing fiends to appear anywhere in the city, forcing the defenders to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. Then the enhancement effects reverse. Spells cast within the Mythal's boundaries becoming weaker rather than stronger, or producing wildly unpredictable results. Finally, the protective barriers that had kept the worst of the fiendish horde at bay simply dissolve, and the full force of the army of darkness pours into Myth Drannor like water through a broken dam. Arms Major Kelvin Allertinal dies, holding the main gate, surrounded by the bodies of dozens of enemies he killed personally. His last words, reported by the few who heard them and survived, are a simple statement of defiance. He dies as he lived, a warrior to the end, buying precious minutes for others to escape. The Akfair die almost to a warrior, making their final stand in the streets they had patrolled for centuries, refusing to abandon their posts even when retreat was clearly the only rational option. The human mages exhaust themselves utterly, casting until their minds burn out from the strain, collapsing where they stand, their last conscious thought satisfaction at the number of enemies they took with them. As night deepens toward dawn, as the battle enters its final hours, the last organized resistance collapses. The defenders are simply overwhelmed, drowned in a flood of enemies too numerous to count. Those few who remain alive fall back toward the eastern gates, still fighting, still trying to buy a few more minutes, a few more seconds for the evacuees who might still be within reach of pursuing enemies. The city's remaining leaders are among the last to leave. They have spent the entire battle coordinating the defense and the evacuation, refusing to abandon their posts even as the situation became hopeless. Only when advisors physically intervene, pointing out that Myth Drannor will need leadership in exile to guide the survivors, does the evacuation of the remaining leadership proceed. Those who escape carry with them a desperate hope, whispered among the refugees as they flee through the darkened forest. Myth Drannor will be reclaimed, they tell each other, clinging to this promise like a lifeline. The dream will be restored, however long it takes, however many centuries must pass. The elves will return and drive out the darkness. It is a vow born of grief and desperation, and in the moment it is made, probably few truly believe it is possible, but it is a vow nonetheless, and those who hear it hold on to it as they run. the sun rises on 714 Dale reckoning to reveal myth Drannor in the hands of the army of darkness. The greatest city in Faerûn, the city of song, the city of beauty, the myth of peace made manifest, is no more. Demons and devils roam its streets, desecrating everything they touch. The beautiful towers are shattered or burning. The singing fountains are smashed and dry. The gardens are trampled and fouled. The libraries that survived the battle are looted and burned. Thousands of years of accumulated knowledge going up in flames, or being torn apart by creatures that cannot read and do not care. The temples are desecrated, their altars overturned, their sacred spaces filled with obscenities. Everything that made myth Drannor special, everything that made it worthy, is being systematically destroyed by beings that exist only to create misery and spread corruption. But the army of darkness has won a hollow victory. The city they conquered is largely empty. The vast majority of myth Drannor's population has escaped. Tens of thousands of civilians have fled into the forest and are even now making their way toward the Elven court or other safe havens. The knowledge that was saved, though only a fraction of what was lost, is enough to preserve the essential achievements of myth Drannor's golden age. The dream has been wounded, perhaps mortally, but it has not been completely extinguished. The fiends celebrate their victory by destroying everything they can reach, but their celebration is short-lived. Almpeter, the mastermind behind the assault, discovers to his rage that the city's greatest treasures have been removed or hidden beyond his ability to find them. The most powerful magical items, the most valuable artifacts, the knowledge that he had hoped to claim, all are gone. He has won a city of ruins and ashes, and the cost to his forces has been staggering. Thousands of demons, devils, drow, and orcs lie dead in the streets and fields around myth Drannor. The army of darkness has been bled white, achieving its victory. Moreover, the Mythal, though corrupted and dying, is not completely dead. Its partial collapse has left it in an unstable state, still possessing power, but no longer controllable. Random magical effects plague the ruins, making them dangerous even for the conquerors. Portions of the city phase in and out of reality. Gravity fails in some areas. Time flows differently in others. The fiends find that they have won a city they cannot fully occupy, a prize that has become a trap. Within months, the army of darkness begins to fracture. With no common enemy to unite them, demons and devils resume their eternal war against each other, fighting in myth Drannor's streets with the same fury they had directed at the Elven defenders. The drow, realizing that there is nothing left to loot and no strategic value in holding ruins, begin to withdraw back to the Underdark. The orc tribes, without the leadership that had united them, splinter into feuding factions and drift away. Almpeter tries to maintain control, but even his brilliant mind cannot overcome the fundamental nature of evil, which is that it cannot cooperate for long without an external threat to focus on. The surviving elves, regrouping at the Elven court and other settlements, face the grim task of accounting for their losses and beginning to rebuild their shattered society. The numbers are devastating. Of the population that had lived in myth, Drannor at the war's beginning, perhaps 1/3 survived the 3 years of siege and the final evacuation. The rest are dead or captured, and those captured by fiends have suffered fates that make death seem merciful by comparison. Entire families have been wiped out. Ancient bloodlines have ended. Skills and knowledge that took centuries to develop are lost forever with the individuals who possessed them. The Harpers, that organization of bards and rangers who had tried so desperately to defend the city, are nearly extinct in the region. Of the over 100 Harpers at twilight who had operated in and around Myth Drannor, fewer than a dozen survived the war. Those survivors are scattered, traumatized, facing the task of rebuilding their organization from almost nothing. Many never recover from what they witnessed, spending the rest of their lives haunted by memories of friends tortured and cities burning. The political consequences ripple outward across Faerûn. The fall of Myth Drannor creates a power vacuum in the region that will take centuries to fill. The Daelins, which had relied on the Elven city for protection and trade, are suddenly exposed and vulnerable. Human settlements that had flourished under Myth Drannor's umbrella now must fend for themselves. The balance of power shifts, and not for the better. Dark forces, emboldened by the fall of the greatest bastion of light and learning, become more aggressive throughout the region. The Elven retreat from Cormanthor begins almost immediately. Many elves, shocked and traumatized by the loss of their greatest city, decide that the mainland of Faerûn is no longer safe for their people. Over the following centuries, more and more elves will abandon Cormanthor for Evermeet, the island across the sea where they can live among their own kind without fear of another catastrophe. This retreat will continue for over 600 years, until by the 1400s Dale reckoning, over 90% of the Elven population has left the forest. The dream of a multiracial society living in harmony is abandoned, and the elves return to isolation, nursing their grief and their memories of what was lost. Myth Drannor itself becomes a legend, a cautionary tale, a symbol of lost glory. Bards sing songs about the city of song that no longer sings. Scholars write treatises about what went wrong, trying to understand how something so magnificent could fall so completely. Treasure hunters and adventurers, drawn by tales of magical riches left behind in the ruins, venture into what remains of the city and almost always die horribly, killed by the fiends that still lurk there, or by the unstable magical effects that plague the area. For over 6 centuries, Myth Drannor remains a haunted ruin, the Mythal corrupted, but still present, still dangerous, still maintaining a twisted semblance of its former function. The forest around it becomes dark, and dangerous, avoided by sane travelers. The city that was once a beacon of hope becomes a source of dread, and its name is spoken in whispers, always with a tone of regret and sorrow. The fall of Myth Drannor marked the end of an age, the destruction of a dream that had promised so much. It demonstrated that even the noblest intentions, even the most powerful magic, even the most magnificent achievements could be destroyed by hatred and evil if that evil was determined enough and willing to pay any price. It showed that cooperation and trust, while beautiful and worthwhile, also create vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those who recognize no such values. The fall taught a generation that hope alone is not sufficient, that dreams must be defended with steel and spell, and that even with the best defense, sometimes darkness wins. Section 6. Aftermath and Eternal Legacy. The ruins of Myth Drannor smolder in the aftermath of its fall, and you stand at the forest's edge, looking toward what remains of the greatest city Faerûn has ever known. Smoke still rises from the shattered towers, visible for miles in every direction, a black stain against the sky that serves as a funeral pyre for civilization itself. The silence is almost worse than the sounds of battle that preceded it. Where once there was music and laughter, learning and creation, now there is only the occasional crackle of dying fires and the distant howls of fiends celebrating their victory. The city of song will never sing again, and the world is diminished by its silence. The immediate aftermath is chaos and suffering on a scale difficult to comprehend. The evacuees who fled during those final desperate days scatter across the forests and valleys of northern Faerûn, trying to reach safety while pursued by enemy forces that are no longer focused on holding Myth Drannor, but are free to hunt down the survivors. Thousands die in the weeks following the city's fall, picked off by roving bands of orcs or caught by drow raiding parties. Families are separated in the confusion, children lost, elders left behind when they can no longer keep pace with the desperate flight. The roads and forest paths leading away from Myth Drannor become littered with the bodies of those who escaped the city only to die within sight of safety. The Elven court, the nearest major Elven settlement, is overwhelmed by the flood of refugees. The small community, which had numbered perhaps a few thousand souls before the fall, suddenly must accommodate tens of thousands of traumatized, desperate survivors who arrive with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the haunted looks in their eyes. The resources of the Elven court are stretched to breaking. Food runs short. Shelter is improvised in every available space. Disease breaks out among the crowded refugees despite the best efforts of healers and priests. The death toll continues to mount even after the immediate danger has passed. Leadership attempts to establish some form of government in exile to maintain some semblance of order and authority, but the task is nearly impossible. The survivors are scattered across multiple settlements. Communication is difficult and dangerous, with enemy forces still active in the region. The political structures that governed Drannor have collapsed along with the city itself. Different factions among the refugees have different ideas about what should be done, where they should go, whether they should attempt to hold territory in Cormanthor or retreat entirely to Evermeet. The unity that the crisis briefly imposed dissolves into arguments and recriminations. The finger-pointing begins almost immediately, even before the ashes have cooled. Who is to blame for the catastrophe? Was it the opening itself, the decision made centuries ago to invite non-elves into what had been an exclusively elven city? Many of the noble houses that had withdrawn from Drannor years earlier certainly think so. They point to the fall as proof that their warnings were correct, that mixing the races was always destined to end in disaster. The fact that humans and dwarves fought and died alongside elves in the city's defense, that the army of darkness made no distinction between races in its appetite for destruction, does not sway these critics. They see what they want to see, confirmation of prejudices they held all along. Others blame the military leadership, claiming that Arms Major Kelvin Allertonal, despite his preparations, failed to adequately defend the city. This criticism is particularly unfair given that Kelvin died heroically in the city's defense. But grief and trauma need targets, and the dead cannot defend themselves. Still others blame the High Mages who created and maintained the Mythal, arguing that they should have foreseen its vulnerability to corruption, or should have found some way to prevent its collapse. The search for scapegoats becomes a way for the survivors to avoid confronting the more difficult truth, that sometimes evil wins despite everyone doing their best, that tragedy can strike even the worthiest and most prepared. The material losses are staggering beyond calculation. The wealth accumulated in Drannor over millennia, the magical items crafted by its finest artificers, the art created by generations of masters, almost all of it is gone. What was not destroyed in the fighting or the fires that followed was looted by the army of darkness or lies, buried in ruins too dangerous to excavate. Priceless treasures that had been lovingly preserved for thousands of years are melted down by demons who care nothing for beauty or history. Magical artifacts of tremendous power fall into the hands of devils who will use them for evil purposes. The libraries, those vast repositories of knowledge, are almost completely destroyed. Centuries of accumulated wisdom, irreplaceable historical records, unique magical research, all turned to ash or torn apart by creatures incapable of reading and uninterested in learning. But the greatest loss is not material. The greatest loss is the dream itself, the vision of different peoples living together in harmony, learning from each other, creating something greater than any could achieve alone. That dream, which had seemed so real during Drannor's golden age, now appears naive. A beautiful illusion shattered by the harsh reality of a world where evil exists and darkness sometimes prevails. The fall of Myth Drannor does not just destroy a city, it destroys hope. It tells the peoples of Faerûn that cooperation is dangerous, that trust is a liability, that the safest course is to stick with your own kind and keep outsiders at arm's length. The Elven retreat from the mainland accelerates dramatically in the centuries following the fall. By 1000 Dale reckoning, less than 300 years after the city's destruction, the majority of Cormanthor's Elven population has departed for Evermeet. The ancient forest, which had been home to Elven civilization for over 4,000 years, is being abandoned. The remaining elves cluster in a few small communities like the Elven Court and Semberhome. But these are shadows of what once was. The great experiment in multiracial cooperation is over, and the elves have voted with their feet, choosing isolation over integration, safety over ambition. The ruins themselves become a legend, a place of terror and dark fascination. The corrupted Mythal, still partially functional despite its collapse, creates a zone of wild magic and strange effects that make the ruins incredibly dangerous even decades after the fall. Gravity functions erratically in some areas. Time flows at different rates in others. Random magical effects manifest without warning or pattern. Sections of the city phase in and out of reality, sometimes appearing solid and intact, other times becoming transparent or vanishing entirely. The forest around the ruins darkens and twists, becoming hostile and unnatural, filled with creatures that should not exist and dangers that defy explanation. Fiends continue to inhabit the ruins for centuries, using them as a base for raids against the surrounding territories. Demons and devils fight each other in the streets where Elven children once played, their battles adding new layers of destruction to what the Weeping War began. The Drow, though they withdrew the bulk of their forces, maintain secret outposts in the ruins and the underdark passages beneath, conducting experiments and rituals in the darkness. Undead rise spontaneously in places where the magical corruption is strongest, animated by the ambient energy rather than by any necromancer's will. Yet despite the danger, despite the near certainty of death awaiting those who venture into the ruins, people still come. Treasure hunters drawn by tales of magical artifacts and ancient wealth risk their lives for the chance at riches. Scholars seek lost knowledge, hoping to recover even a few scraps of the vast learning that was lost. Adventurers test themselves against the ruins' dangers, seeking glory and the chance to claim they survived where so many others perished. Almost all of them die. Their bones join the layers of remains already carpeting Myth Drannor's streets, anonymous additions to the city's vast graveyard. The stories about Myth Drannor grow with the telling, becoming larger than life, mixing fact and legend. until it becomes impossible to separate the two. Bards sing of towers that reached the clouds, though the tallest were only a few 100 feet high. They speak of fountains that granted immortality when they only provided clean water. They describe treasures beyond measure, and on this point, at least, they are not exaggerating. The reality of what myth Drannor was gets lost beneath the mythology of what it has become. But perhaps that is fitting. The city has passed from history into legend, and legends follow their own rules. Some among the elves never give up on the dream of reclaiming myth Drannor. The vows made in the anguish of defeat, as refugees fled the burning city, become rallying cries for those who refuse to accept that the fall is permanent. Various plans are proposed over the centuries. Military expeditions are organized to drive out the fiends and retake the ruins. These expeditions invariably fail, often catastrophically, adding to the death toll and proving that the corrupted Mythal and the forces occupying the ruins are still far too powerful to overcome through conventional means. It is not until over 1,300 years after the fall, in the year 1372 Dale Reckoning, that a serious attempt to reclaim myth Drannor finally succeeds, at least partially and temporarily. A coalition of elves, supported by human and dwarven allies, manages to clear much of the ruins and begins the slow, dangerous process of trying to restore what was lost. They discover that the passage of time has not made the ruins less dangerous. If anything, the accumulation of centuries of magical corruption has made them worse. But they persist, driven by the belief that myth Drannor must be reclaimed, that its dream must be restored. This restoration is short-lived. Within decades, new disasters strike. The corrupted Mythal proves impossible to fully repair or control. New enemies appear, drawn by the renewed activity in the ruins. By the mid-1400s Dale Reckoning, myth Drannor is once again a ruin, destroyed for a second time, proving that some things once broken cannot be fully mended, that some dreams once shattered cannot be perfectly reassembled. Yet the legend persists. The name myth Drannor continues to resonate across the centuries, a symbol of lost glory and tragic fall. It becomes a touchstone for discussions about cooperation and isolation, about the risks of openness versus the safety of keeping to one's own. Philosophers debate whether myth Drannor's fall proves that multiracial societies are inherently unstable, or whether it simply demonstrates that even the best societies can be destroyed by sufficient external force. There are no easy answers, and the arguments continue generation after generation. What lessons can be drawn from myth Drannor's fall? You stand now at the very end of this long tale, looking back across the centuries at what happened and what it means. The lessons are complex, sometimes contradictory, never simple or comforting. Myth Drannor teaches that noble dreams are worth pursuing even when they are difficult and dangerous. It teaches that cooperation between different peoples can achieve magnificent things that none could accomplish alone. It teaches that beauty and knowledge and art are valuable beyond measure and worth defending with everything you have. But it also teaches that good intentions are not enough, that idealism without adequate defense is vulnerability, that trust must be balanced with wisdom. It teaches that evil exists in the world, that there are forces which hate beauty and goodness and will work tirelessly to destroy them. It teaches that even the mightiest civilizations can fall, that nothing built by mortal hands is truly permanent, that all things eventually end. These are hard lessons, bitter truths that many would prefer not to face, but they are truths nonetheless. Myth Drannor's legacy is not only in its fall, but in what it achieved during its existence. For over 400 years, the city stood as living proof that different peoples could live together in peace and mutual enrichment. 400 years is not forever, but it is a long time, multiple human lifetimes, long enough for entire generations to be born, live, and die knowing only cooperation and harmony. The knowledge created in Myth Drannor, though much was lost, enough survived to influence magical development across Faerûn for centuries. The art produced there, the few pieces that escaped destruction, remains among the finest ever created. The memory of what was achieved continues to inspire those who believe that a better world is possible. The fall of Myth Drannor is a tragedy, perhaps the greatest tragedy in Faerûn's long history. But tragedy does not erase what came before. The Golden Age happened. It was real. Thousands of people lived lives of meaning and beauty in that city. They learned and loved and created and dreamed. Their lives mattered. Their achievements mattered. The fact that it ended badly does not retroactively make it worthless. If anything, the tragedy makes it more precious. A reminder that nothing good lasts forever and therefore must be cherished while it exists. You stand at the end of this story now, having walked with me through Myth Drannor's entire history. From its founding as Cormanthor through its transformation into the city of song, through its golden age of wonder and achievement, through the gathering shadows and the terrible war that destroyed it, through its fall and the aftermath that followed. You have witnessed the rise and fall of the greatest city Faerûn has ever known. You have seen what mortals can achieve when they work together in good faith, and what can be destroyed when evil musters its full strength against the light. The ruins of Myth Drannor still exist in the forest of Cormanthor, haunted and dangerous, a monument to lost glory. The name still echoes through bardic songs and scholarly treatises. The dream it represented, though shattered, has not entirely died. Somewhere in the world, perhaps even now, there are those who believe that what was achieved once might be achieved again, that different peoples might yet learn to live together in peace, that the vision of Myth Drannor could be realized anew. Whether they are right remains to be seen. History has not yet finished writing that chapter. But this chapter the story of the original myth Drannor, the city of song that rose to heights of glory and fell into darkness. This story is complete. You have heard it now in full. Every triumph and every tragedy, every hope and every horror. May you remember it. May you learn from it. May you honor those who lived and died in the belief that a better world was possible. And may you carry that belief forward into whatever future awaits. If you found value in this deep exploration of myth, Drannor's history, if this journey through one of the most significant events in Faerûn's long timeline resonated with you, I would be grateful if you would like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more deep dives into the lore and legends of dungeons and dragons to explore together. Your support makes it possible to continue this work, to keep researching and writing and sharing these tales with you. Thank you for walking this path with me, for spending this time in the ruins of the City of Song. Until we meet again in the next story, may your own dreams be grand and your own courage sufficient to defend them.